There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry around in their heads. It involves two superpowers glaring at each other across an ideological divide, occasionally rattling sabers, occasionally negotiating, and ultimately arriving at a kind of exhausted peace when one side simply ran out of the resources to keep pretending. That version is not exactly wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, because it implies a level of human control over events that the historical record does not support. The Cold War was not a standoff managed by careful men in quiet rooms. It was a standoff managed by procedures, by systems, by bureaucratic chains of authority that were deliberately designed to remove the hesitation that human beings feel before doing something irreversible. The men in those quiet rooms were often the last to know what was actually happening, and in several cases they were not informed at all until after the moment of maximum danger had already passed. What follows is an account of 21 classified systems, programs, and operational realities from the Cold War period that were built around a single shared assumption. That assumption was that civilization as it existed in the mid-20th century might end on very short notice, and that the correct response to this possibility was not to prevent the end, but to prepare a bureaucratic procedure for surviving it, retaliating through it, and if necessary, initiating it. These systems were not aberrations. They were the logical conclusion of deterrence theory, when deterrence theory was taken seriously by the people responsible for implementing it. They were the architecture of a war that was always being rehearsed, but never quite declared. And understanding them requires accepting that the absence of nuclear exchange during this period was not the result of wisdom or restraint at the highest levels of command. It was the result of mechanical failure, misidentified radar signals, exhausted technicians, and the occasional individual decision made by someone far below the level of policy who chose, in a moment of genuine uncertainty, not to push the button. The first system that deserves serious examination is not a weapon. It is a command architecture, and its name was the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which the American military referred to internally as the PSYOP. The PSYOP was the master nuclear war plan of the United States, and it underwent numerous revisions between its first formal iteration in 1960 and its eventual replacement decades later. What made the PSYOP remarkable was not its ambition, although its ambition was extraordinary. The early versions called for delivering thousands of nuclear warheads against targets across the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe within a compressed time window, with kill estimates in the tens of millions calculated as planning variables rather than moral considerations. What made it remarkable was its rigidity. The PSYOP was not a flexible instrument. It was a machine that, once started, was extremely difficult to stop or modify. Senior military planners who reviewed it in the early 1960s were disturbed to discover that the plan had almost no options for limited nuclear use. You could execute the plan, or you could not execute it. There was very little space between those two choices. Robert McNamara, who became Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, reviewed an early briefing on the PSYOP and reportedly left the room without speaking. He had understood in that moment that American nuclear strategy at its most fundamental level was not a strategy. It was a single catastrophic instruction waiting to be carried out. The reason this matters beyond the historical footnote is what it reveals about how the system was designed. The PSYOP existed because military planners had determined that in a genuine nuclear exchange, the time available to make decisions would be measured in minutes. Missiles launched from Soviet submarines positioned off the American coast might reach Washington in less than 10 minutes. Land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles would take longer, perhaps 30 minutes, but the warning time available to the President and military command was never guaranteed to be accurate or even reliable. Given these time constraints, the decision was made, implicitly and explicitly, that flexibility was a luxury that could not be afforded. What was needed was a pre-authorized, pre-planned, pre-coordinated response that could be executed without deliberation. The PSYOP was the answer to that requirement. It was a document designed to replace the president's judgment with a procedure in the moments when judgment would be most dangerous to rely upon. This logic extended downward through the chain of command in ways that created what military theorists later called the delegation problem. If the president might be killed in a first strike, and if the response had to be launched quickly, then the authority to launch had to be distributed to subordinate commanders who would survive. And if those commanders were to have meaningful authority, they had to be able to exercise it without waiting for confirmation from above. This meant that by the middle of the Cold War, there were multiple American military officers at various levels of command who possessed at least partial authority to initiate nuclear launches under specific circumstances, and who were operating under instructions that had been written years earlier and that did not fully account for the particular crisis they might find themselves in. The system was designed to function even if the civilian leadership was dead. This also meant it was designed to function even if the civilian leadership was uncertain or uninformed, or had decided in the final moments that they did not want it to function. That tension was never resolved. It was managed through procedure and compartmentalization and carefully worded authorizations, but it was never resolved. The second system worth examining is the American Early Warning Network as it existed in the 1950s and 1960s. Before digital computing made it more reliable, but also, paradoxically, more capable of generating sophisticated false alarms. The distant early warning line, which most people know as the DEW line, was a chain of radar stations stretching across the northern edge of the North American continent through Canada and Alaska and Greenland, designed to detect Soviet bombers approaching over the Arctic. The DW line was a genuine engineering achievement, built in extraordinarily hostile conditions by thousands of workers over several years. It was also a system that produced false contacts with a regularity that should have been alarming, but that was instead managed through procedural normalization. Radar operators learned to distinguish between goose flocks and Soviet bombers, between atmospheric anomalies and incoming aircraft, through experience and judgment, and a kind of institutional intuition that was passed down between shifts. This worked most of the time. It did not always work. In October of 1960, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, a more advanced radar installation in Thule, Greenland, reported a massive Soviet missile launch. The alert reached NORAD headquarters and sent the command authority into a state of elevated readiness that, in a slightly different institutional context, might have triggered a retaliatory response. The cause of the alert was the moon. The radar system had detected the rising moon over Norway and interpreted its reflection as a massive incoming strike. This was not a minor glitch. The system had been operating for approximately 3 months and had not been calibrated to account for this particular astronomical event. The procedures that existed for verifying alerts were applied, and the alert was eventually identified as a false alarm. But the time elapsed between the initial warning and the determination that it was false was long enough, in any genuine crisis, to have required decisions that could not be easily unmade. The third system, and one that remained classified for decades longer than most of its contemporaries, was the network of sealed authentication codes and pre-delegated launch authorities that existed within American nuclear-armed forces positioned in Europe during the Cold War. These forces included tactical nuclear weapons, which were shorter-range weapons designed for use on the battlefield, and they were positioned in locations that were considerably less secure than the intercontinental missiles housed in hardened silos in the American interior. The authentication procedures for these weapons were, in the early years of the Cold War, inadequate in ways that nuclear security specialists who were later granted access to the historical record described as deeply troubling. There were American nuclear weapons stored in European locations where the physical security was maintained by host nation military personnel who were not themselves subject to American personnel reliability programs. There were scenarios in which the custody arrangements for these weapons were ambiguous enough that it was not entirely clear from a procedural standpoint who had the authority to use them and under what circumstances. What is particularly significant about the tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe is the operational context in which their use was contemplated. American war plans for a Soviet invasion of Western Europe in the 1950s and into the 1960s assumed that nuclear weapons would be used relatively early in any conventional conflict, not as a last resort, but as a means of compensating for the numerical disadvantage American and NATO forces faced against Warsaw Pact ground forces. The nuclear artillery shells, the nuclear landmines, the short-range ballistic missiles positioned in Germany were not intended to signal escalation. They were intended to be used on the battlefield, against armored columns, against supply depots, against the kind of military targets that in any previous war would have been destroyed by conventional explosives. The institutional assumption embedded in NATO war planning was that a war in Europe would become nuclear in its early stages, and that this was an acceptable and manageable reality. This assumption was not shared by the populations of the countries in which the weapons were deployed, because it was not shared with them. The fourth system is one that most people, even those with serious interest in Cold War history, have never encountered under its operational name. Within the American nuclear command structure, there existed a set of procedures known informally as the two-man rule, and more formally as the Personnel Reliability Program, combined with the Permissive Action Link system. The Permissive Action Link, or PAL, was a locking mechanism installed in nuclear weapons to prevent unauthorized use. Its development was driven in part by a specific and disturbing realization that emerged from a study of American nuclear forces in the late 1950s. That study found that the existing safeguards against unauthorized nuclear use were substantially weaker than the political leadership had been led to believe. Specifically, it found that a single determined individual with the right combination of access and technical knowledge could, under the existing procedures, arm and potentially deliver a nuclear weapon without authorization. The Permissive Action Link was the technical response to this problem. But the Permissive Action Link was not implemented uniformly or quickly, and in the interval between the recognition of the problem and the deployment of adequate solutions, American nuclear weapons were guarded by procedures that were described by internal reviewers as insufficient. The fifth classified operational reality of the Cold War is the Soviet nuclear command system, which was different from the American system in ways that reflected different institutional cultures and different assessments of the threat environment. The Soviet command structure was, by American standards, considerably more centralized in its formal design and considerably more opaque in its actual operation. Western intelligence agencies spent enormous resources trying to understand how Soviet Nuclear Launch Authority actually functioned, and the conclusions they reached were frequently revised as new information became available. What is now understood, based on documents that became accessible after the Soviet collapse, is that the Soviet system contained within it a formal mechanism for delegating nuclear launch authority downward to field commanders under specific circumstances. This mechanism was not the result of institutional carelessness. It was a deliberate design feature rooted in the Soviet assessment that American first strike capabilities might succeed in decapitating the Central Soviet Command Authority, and that survivable retaliation therefore required pre-delegated authority at lower command levels. The sixth system worth examining in detail is the American reconnaissance program that operated under the designation Corona, and later under related programs that remained classified for decades after the program itself was acknowledged. Corona was the first successful American photographic reconnaissance satellite program, and its existence was not publicly confirmed until 1995. Before Corona, American intelligence assessments of Soviet military capabilities were based on a combination of signal intelligence, defector reports, and the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft program, each of which had significant limitations. The U-2 program provided extraordinary photographic intelligence, but required overflights of Soviet territory, which were politically explosive and operationally dangerous, as demonstrated conclusively when Francis Gary Powers was shot down in May of 1960. Corona provided a more survivable and scalable alternative. What is less well understood about Corona is the degree to which the intelligence it produced shaped American assessments of Soviet nuclear capabilities, and specifically how those assessments corrected what had become known as the missile gap. The missile gap was the belief, widespread in American political and military circles in the late 1950s, that the Soviet Union had developed a substantial lead in intercontinental ballistic missiles, and that the United States was therefore in a position of strategic vulnerability. This belief drove enormous increases in American defense spending and shaped the political environment in which the 1960 presidential election was conducted. What Corona intelligence revealed was that the missile gap was largely a fiction. The Soviet Union had deployed far fewer operational ICBMs than American intelligence had estimated. This was reassuring in one sense but troubling in another, because it meant that American defense policy in the late 1950s had been shaped by a threat assessment that was substantially wrong, and that the institutional processes responsible for producing threat assessments had failed in ways that had significant policy consequences. The lesson that some analysts drew from this was that superior intelligence reduced the risk of miscalculation. The lesson that others drew, with equal justification, was that intelligence agencies operating under institutional pressure to identify threats would find threats whether they were there or not. The seventh system is the naval component of American nuclear deterrence, specifically the Polaris submarine program and the institutional arrangements it created. The Polaris missile, deployed on American nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines beginning in 1960, represented a genuinely revolutionary development in nuclear strategy because it was survivable in a way that land-based missiles were not. A ballistic missile submarine at sea in a position unknown to the adversary could not be destroyed in a first strike. This meant that the threat of retaliation it represented was credible in a way that other elements of the nuclear force were not. It also meant that the officers commanding those submarines operated in a communications environment that was inherently constrained, because the physics of radio wave propagation make it extremely difficult to communicate with deeply submerged submarines. American ballistic missile submarines were equipped to receive certain types of communications while submerged, but the bandwidth available was very limited and the reliability was not absolute. This created an operational reality that has rarely been discussed with complete frankness in official accounts. An American ballistic missile submarine at sea, in the event of a nuclear exchange that destroyed or disrupted American command authority, might receive no communications at all. The procedures that governed what submarine commanders were supposed to do in that circumstance were classified and remained so for a very long time. What can be said with confidence is that the procedures existed, that they contemplated scenarios in which the submarine commander was the effective decision authority for a significant nuclear capability, and that the criteria for action in the absence of communications were necessarily based on inference and judgment rather than confirmed orders. The men who served as commanders of American ballistic missile submarines during the Cold War were selected with extraordinary care, trained extensively, and subjected to psychological evaluation. They were also placed in a position where the institutional logic of their mission required them to be able to act on their own assessment of events, in circumstances of profound uncertainty. The eighth system that belongs in this account is the Soviet naval component of nuclear deterrence, which differed from the American in ways that created specific dangers. Soviet ballistic missile submarines in the early Cold War period were, by American standards, significantly less reliable mechanically and operated under command arrangements that were sometimes unclear. The most significant documented incident involving Soviet naval nuclear forces during the Cold War occurred in October of 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis and remained classified for decades. A Soviet submarine, the B-59, operating in the area of the quarantine line established by American naval forces around Cuba, was subjected to harassment by American anti-submarine forces. The B-59 was a diesel-electric submarine, which meant it had to surface periodically to recharge its batteries. The American ships dropped signaling depth charges near the submarine, which was standard procedure for communicating to a submerged submarine that it should surface and identify itself, but the charges were not clearly distinguishable from what the crew of the B-59 would have felt if they were being attacked. The B-59 was carrying a nuclear torpedo. The authority to fire that weapon was vested under Soviet naval procedures that applied under extreme circumstances in a combination of officers including the captain and a political officer. In the conditions prevailing in the submarine during those hours, with the crew believing they might be under attack, with communications to Moscow having been lost days earlier, and with the captain having determined that war might already have begun, the decision to fire the nuclear torpedo was discussed. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, reportedly argued for its use. A senior officer on board, Vasily Arkhipov, who held a position that gave him effective veto authority over the use of the weapon, refused to authorize it. The submarine surfaced. The crisis passed. The individuals who were aware of this incident within the relevant command structures at the time kept it within classified channels, and the broader public remained unaware of how close the Cuban Missile Crisis had come to a nuclear exchange at sea until researchers began gaining access to the relevant documentation in the decades following the Soviet collapse. The ninth system in this account is the nuclear war planning apparatus of the Soviet Union as it related to China. Because the Cold War was not a bilateral confrontation in the simple way that the term superpower standoff implies. By the early 1960s, the Sino-Soviet relationship had deteriorated to the point where Soviet strategic planners were required to treat China as a potential adversary while simultaneously managing the confrontation with the United States. Soviet nuclear war plans, to whatever extent they are now accessible through declassified archives, contemplated scenarios involving China that were not publicly acknowledged. More significantly, the Soviet Union in the late 1960s and early 1970s made approaches to the United States through diplomatic channels that were sufficiently indirect to maintain deniability, that explored whether the American government would acquiesce in, or perhaps cooperate with, a Soviet preemptive strike against Chinese nuclear facilities. The American response to these approaches, and the manner in which they were processed within the American government, reflects the degree to which nuclear targeting and nuclear policy intersected with broader geopolitical considerations in ways that were never fully transparent even to senior officials. The 10th system that belongs in this account is the command and control arrangement that governed American nuclear weapons positioned in South Korea, Turkey, and other forward locations during the period of maximum Cold War tension. These weapons were subject to the general framework of American nuclear custody and authentication procedures, but the operational circumstances in which they might be used created specific problems that were recognized internally and addressed through procedural means that were less robust than the public framing of nuclear safety implied. The Jupiters in Turkey, which became internationally known during the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Soviet Union identified them as a direct provocation given their proximity to Soviet territory, were liquid-fueled missiles that required several hours of preparation before launch. They were therefore vulnerable to destruction in a first strike, which meant that any rational use of them in a crisis would require very early launch. This created pressure toward pre-delegation of launch authority that was in tension with the formal chain of command requirements. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy was informed that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey were effectively covered by authorization procedures that might not require presidential confirmation before launch in certain circumstances. This was alarming to the president and contributed to his decision to agree, as part of the crisis resolution, to remove the Jupiters from Turkey on a schedule that would allow the removal to be characterized as a routine NATO modernization rather than a concession to Soviet pressure. The missiles were removed. The secret agreement regarding the Jupiters was not revealed publicly for many years. The 11th system deserving examination is the early Soviet missile defense program and the institutional dynamics it created within American strategic planning. Soviet work on missile defense, on systems designed to intercept and destroy incoming ballistic missiles before they reach their targets, was a genuine source of concern within American military planning circles because it threatened the logic of deterrence. Deterrence worked in the formulation that dominated American strategic thinking because both sides believed that a first strike could not prevent devastating retaliation. A successful missile defense system would change this calculus by potentially allowing the side that possessed it to absorb a retaliatory strike without catastrophic consequences. The American response to the Soviet missile defense program was not to pursue arms control measures that would limit such systems, though that was eventually pursued, but first to develop technical approaches to defeating missile defenses. These included multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, which placed multiple warheads on a single missile, and various decoy and penetration aid technologies. The arms race in this domain was institutional and bureaucratic as much as it was technological, driven by threat assessments, acquisition processes, and budget cycles that had their own momentum. The 12th system is the network of technical intelligence collection that both superpowers maintained against each other throughout the Cold War, and specifically the electronic intelligence, or ELINT, programs that monitored the operational signatures of nuclear forces. American ELINT collection programs operating from aircraft, ships, ground stations, and eventually satellites accumulated detailed intelligence on Soviet missile tests, radar systems, and communication networks. This intelligence was used to inform threat assessments and to develop techniques for defeating Soviet air defenses and early warning systems. Soviet intelligence programs did the same in reverse. What this created was a situation in which each side had detailed knowledge of the other's operational systems at a technical level, while remaining profoundly uncertain about the other's intentions and decision-making processes. The asymmetry between technical intelligence and political intelligence was a persistent feature of Cold War threat assessment, and it contributed to the kind of worst-case planning that made the systems described here seem necessary. The 13th system in this account is the British nuclear deterrent program, and the particular vulnerabilities it created within the NATO alliance. The British independently maintained a nuclear deterrent for most of the Cold War, first delivered by aircraft and later by submarine. The existence of an independent British nuclear force meant that the formal command and control arrangements within NATO were more complex than the simple American-Soviet standoff would suggest. British targeting plans were coordinated with American plans, but were not identical to them. And the question of what British forces would do in a scenario where the United States had not authorized or initiated nuclear use was a persistent source of institutional anxiety within the alliance. The British also maintained a considerably smaller nuclear force than the Americans, which meant that the deterrence value of that force rested on its ability to credibly threaten the Soviet Union with a level of damage that the Soviet Union would find unacceptable. The credibility of this threat was examined and debated within classified British government documents, whose declassification has provided historians with a detailed picture of the institutional anxiety that surrounded nuclear deterrence at the policy level. The 14th system that belongs here is the network of nuclear weapons storage sites that existed throughout Western Europe during the Cold War, many of which were located in populated areas and were maintained under security arrangements that varied considerably in their rigor. The American nuclear weapons stored at these sites were subject to American custody procedures, but the sites themselves were frequently located on or adjacent to bases operated by host nation forces. The relationship between American custody requirements and host nation operational control was a recurring source of institutional friction, managed through bilateral agreements that were not publicly disclosed. The safety and security of these weapons was assessed periodically through classified evaluations, and the results of those evaluations sometimes identified vulnerabilities that were addressed through procedural modifications rather than through physical improvements, because physical improvements required resources and political decisions that were more difficult to arrange than changes to written procedures. The 15th system is the Soviet analog of the American PSYOP, the operational planning structure that governed Soviet nuclear use, and what is known about it from documents that became accessible after the Soviet collapse reveals a planning culture that was in some respects more rigid and in some respects more adaptive than its American counterpart. Soviet nuclear war planning was centered on the concept of a strategic operation, a coordinated military action that would integrate nuclear strikes with conventional military operations against NATO. The scale of destruction contemplated in Soviet war plans for a European conflict was extraordinary, with nuclear strikes planned against hundreds of targets, including ports, airfields, command centers, nuclear weapon storage sites, and major population centers. What is particularly significant about Soviet war planning, as it is now understood, is the degree to which it was defensive in its orientation, in the sense that it was built around the assumption of a NATO first strike. Soviet planners consistently assessed that the United States might initiate nuclear use in a European war, and they structured their forces and plans accordingly, which meant that Soviet forces were configured for rapid response, which in turn reinforced American concerns about Soviet aggressive intentions. The 16th system is the network of dead-hand and launch-on-warning procedures that both superpowers developed as their early warning systems became more sophisticated and as the vulnerability of fixed nuclear installations became better understood. The Soviet version of a dead-hand system, which became known in the West under the name perimeter, is the most extensively documented example of a system designed to ensure nuclear retaliation, even if Soviet command authority was entirely destroyed. Perimeter, as it is understood from Russian sources that have become available since the Soviet collapse, was a semi-automated system that could, under specific triggering conditions, authorize and execute a nuclear launch without requiring human decision at the moment of launch. The system required human decision to activate it and would check for specific indicators before proceeding, but once activated and once those indicators were present, it was capable of sending launch commands through a dedicated communication system that bypassed the normal command hierarchy. The American equivalent, though less formally documented, involved pre-delegated launch authority combined with command systems designed to survive nuclear attack. The philosophical difference between the two approaches is significant. The American approach attempted to maintain human decision-making authority throughout, even while distributing that authority to survive decapitation. The Soviet approach, at least in its most extreme implementation, created a system that could execute the decision without requiring a decision-maker. This distinction matters not because one approach is clearly superior to the other in some ethical sense, but because both approaches reflect the same underlying institutional reality. Both superpowers had concluded that the time constraints imposed by nuclear weapons technology made traditional command hierarchies potentially inadequate for the task of ensuring retaliation, and both had responded by designing systems that reduced the role of human judgment in the moment of maximum consequence. The 17th system worth documenting in detail is the series of accidents involving nuclear weapons that both superpowers experienced during the Cold War, and that were handled through institutional processes designed to minimize public awareness. The American nuclear weapon accidents, which the military designated with the euphemism broken arrows, included incidents of sufficient severity to have contaminated land with radioactive material in Spain and Greenland. In January of 1966, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a refueling tanker aircraft over the Spanish coast near the town of Palomares. The bombs were not armed and therefore did not produce a nuclear explosion, but the conventional high explosives in 2 of the weapons detonated on impact with the ground, dispersing plutonium over an area of the Spanish countryside that required a significant American cleanup operation. The cleanup was conducted under conditions of considerable diplomatic sensitivity because the Spanish government of Francisco Franco had not publicly acknowledged that American aircraft routinely flew over Spanish territory carrying nuclear weapons, and the incident created political difficulties that required careful management. In January of 1968, a second B-52 accident occurred, this time near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The aircraft suffered a fire in the crew compartment, forcing the crew to bail out without a pilot to attempt an emergency landing. The aircraft crashed on the sea ice of North Star Bay, and the resulting fire caused the conventional explosives in the nuclear weapons on board to detonate, again without producing a nuclear explosion but with significant dispersion of radioactive material. The cleanup operation in Greenland was more complex than the one in Spain because of the Arctic conditions and the need to recover radioactive debris from beneath the sea ice. American officials dealing with the Greenland accident discovered that one of the 4 nuclear weapons involved appeared to be unaccounted for. The search for that weapon, conducted in extreme conditions, did not definitively recover it. The possibility that a nuclear weapon or significant portions of one remains at the bottom of the sea near Thule has not been resolved to the satisfaction of all the researchers who have examined the available evidence. The Soviet Union experienced its own nuclear weapon accidents, which remained even more thoroughly suppressed in official channels for a longer period. A serious accident at a Soviet ballistic missile installation in 1960, which killed the head of Soviet strategic rocket forces among many others, resulted from a decision to fuel a missile while personnel was still in the immediate area, in violation of safety procedures that existed precisely to prevent such an event. The decision was made because of schedule pressure and the presence of senior officials who wished to observe a test launch. The resulting explosion and fire killed scores of people and destroyed the launch facility. This incident, known in Russian historical literature as the Nedelin catastrophe, was not acknowledged publicly by the Soviet government until decades after it occurred. The 18th system in this account is the network of communication and intelligence assets that both sides maintained in and around Cuba following the missile crisis, which is often treated as a concluded episode when it was actually the beginning of a sustained period of intensive surveillance and occasional confrontation. American intelligence operations in and around Cuba continued for years after the missile crisis, including operations by the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA that involved technical collection against the Soviet military personnel and equipment that remained on the island. Soviet intelligence operations targeting the American naval base at Guantanamo were similarly intensive. The result was a local environment of persistent mutual surveillance in a geographic area that had already demonstrated its capacity to produce a near-catastrophic crisis, maintained by institutional processes that had no particular mechanism for de-escalation. The 19th system that deserves examination is the series of organizational arrangements that govern the NATO nuclear planning process, specifically the Nuclear Planning Group that was established in the mid-1960s as a mechanism for giving non-nuclear NATO allies a voice in nuclear strategy without giving them actual control over nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Planning Group was a diplomatic solution to a political problem. West Germany and other NATO allies had legitimate concerns about how and whether American nuclear weapons would be used in their defense, and they wanted some degree of participation in the planning for that use. The American response was to create a consultative process that provided the appearance of participation while preserving American decision-making authority. The classified reality of how this process functioned, revealed through documents that have become available over the years, shows that the consultation was often nominal and that the actual planning decisions were made within American military and civilian bureaucracies and then presented to allies in forms that did not invite substantive modification. The 20th system in this account is the Ryan intelligence program, which was a Soviet intelligence collection effort initiated in the early 1980s to monitor indicators of an American first strike. Ryan, which stood for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, or nuclear missile attack, was a systematic program that required Soviet intelligence services to collect and report on a specific list of indicators that Soviet analysts had determined would signal preparations for an American nuclear attack. The program was driven by a genuine and deeply held belief within the Soviet leadership in the early 1980s, particularly under Yuri Andropov, that the United States might be preparing or planning a preemptive nuclear strike. This belief was not irrational given the rhetoric and some of the actions of the Reagan administration in its first term. which included significant increases in defense spending, deployment of new missile systems in Europe, and public statements about the possibility of prevailing in a nuclear war. Ryan created a feedback dynamic in which Soviet intelligence officers were required to report on indicators of American attack preparations, which meant they had institutional incentives to find and report such indicators, which meant that Soviet leadership received intelligence reporting that confirmed their concerns, which meant that Soviet forces were maintained at levels of readiness that were themselves observable by American intelligence, which contributed to American assessments that the Soviet Union might be preparing aggressive action. This feedback dynamic reached its most dangerous point in November of 1983 during a NATO exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to practice NATO nuclear release procedures, and it included features that were new compared to previous iterations of the exercise, including participation by heads of government and realistic simulation of the communications and decision processes that would accompany actual nuclear use authorization. Soviet intelligence services, operating under Ryan guidance, monitored the exercise intensively, and several Soviet analysts concluded that it might not be an exercise at all. The possibility that Able Archer 83 was a cover for actual preparations for a nuclear first strike was considered seriously within the Soviet intelligence community. Soviet nuclear forces were reportedly brought to an elevated state of readiness during the exercise. The exercise concluded without incident. American officials were not fully aware of the Soviet reaction until a British intelligence asset within Soviet intelligence provided information that allowed analysts to reconstruct what had happened. The 21st system in this account is the most abstract of all the systems described here, and in some ways the most consequential. It is the system of institutional knowledge about near misses, accidents, false alarms, and command and control vulnerabilities that both superpowers accumulated during the Cold War and managed through classification rather than through public acknowledgement. Both governments understood, at various levels of their bureaucracies, that the nuclear deterrent system they had constructed was more fragile than its public presentation suggested. Both governments understood that accidents had occurred, that false alarms had generated responses that, in a slightly different operational context, might have led to actual launches, that the human beings operating the systems were fallible in ways that no procedural safeguard could fully correct. Both governments chose, as a matter of deliberate institutional policy, to manage this knowledge within classified channels rather than to share it with the populations whose survival depended on the system's reliability. The reasons for this choice were not entirely cynical. There were genuine arguments advanced by serious people that public knowledge of near misses and system vulnerabilities would undermine confidence in deterrence, would create political pressure for unilateral disarmament or for arms control agreements that the military establishments on both sides considered premature or inadequate, and would generally complicate the maintenance of the bureaucratic equilibrium that kept the nuclear standoff from becoming something worse. These arguments had some validity. They also had the consequence of creating a situation in which the people making decisions about nuclear policy were systematically better informed than the people on whose behalf those decisions were made, and in which the accumulated experience of system failures and near catastrophes could not inform public political choices because the experience was not public. The most formally documented single incident in which an individual human decision prevented what might have been a catastrophic nuclear exchange occurred in September of 1983, when a Soviet missile warning system designated OKO reported that the United States had launched a single intercontinental ballistic missile toward the Soviet Union. The officer on duty at the command center that processed OKO alerts was a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. The alert he received indicated a missile launch, and OKO was a system in which his role was to report such alerts to higher command authority, which would then initiate the response process. Petrov assessed the alert and concluded it was probably a false alarm. His reasoning was based on operational considerations. A genuine American first strike would not begin with a single missile. The OCO system was known to have experienced technical problems. He reported the alert as a probable system malfunction. He was correct. The OCO satellite had misinterpreted sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds as a missile launch. The system had a known vulnerability to this type of false reading under specific geometric conditions that existed on that day. Had Petrov reported the alert as a genuine launch rather than a probable false alarm, the subsequent response process would have involved senior military officials and potentially political leadership, all of whom would have been operating under extreme time pressure with an alert from a system that was formally classified as reliable. What decision they would have made is not knowable. What is clear is that the decision not to report the alert as genuine was made by a single individual, acting on his own judgment, in circumstances where both institutional pressure and formal procedure pointed toward treating the alert as real. The moment of maximum danger in September of 1983 was resolved not by the wisdom of policymakers or by the reliability of the technical systems, but by one man's decision that the system was probably wrong. The Cold War ended in a sequence of events between 1989 and 1991 that were driven by political and economic forces within the Soviet Union rather than by any resolution of the nuclear confrontation. The Berlin Wall came down. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. The Soviet Union itself ceased to exist as a political entity in December of 1991. These events were extraordinary, and they changed the geopolitical landscape in ways that were genuinely historic. What they did not do was dismantle the systems described in this account. The nuclear weapons remained. The command and control architectures remained, modified and adapted, but not fundamentally redesigned. The institutional cultures that had produced the PSYOP, the Ryan program, the pre-delegated launch authorities, and the procedural management of near-miss information continued to operate within the organizations that survived the Cold War's end. The early warning systems remained operational. The ballistic missile submarines continued their patrols. The targeting plans were revised to reflect the changed political circumstances, but the technical infrastructure of nuclear confrontation did not disappear with the political confrontation that had justified its creation. The systems designed for total collapse remained in place, maintained by institutions whose reason for existing had changed, but whose procedures and capabilities had not. The 21st century inherited these systems intact, operated by governments that had been elected on domestic political platforms and that were not required, as a condition of holding power, to have thought carefully about what they had inherited or what they intended to do with it.